Welcome back to another crochet tutorial with Cozy Rosie UK, and today I'm sharing with you this beautiful granny square pattern that is used for the happy square in the In the Mood projects. If you're not already taking part in the In the Mood project, you can find out more by hitting the link in the description box below, where you'll be able to download your In the Mood tracker and determine which mood you have over the last 7 days. There are 7 different special stitches depending on which mood you select, and the happy stitch is this beautiful puff stitch. So that you can see the comparison, I've made up the square in a solid colour as well, although I'm using these lovely bright colours for our tutorial today, just so you can see that this beautiful texture shows up whichever colourway you choose to use. The yarn weight that I'm using for my In the Mood blanket is a DK weight yarn, which is the equivalent of a size 3 yarn in the US sizing. Now this is Hayfield Spirit DK or double knitting, which is in shade Sundown, shade number 0408. And I absolutely love how these colours look. Yes, they are absolutely stunning in the ball, but they also work up beautifully because it's quite a long self-striping yarn. So all the squares work out differently as you move through the ball of yarn. Now, roughly each square uses between 35 and 50 meters of yarn, and there's quite a few meters on these balls. I think it is, yep, there we are, 345 meters. So you're going to get a lot of your In the Mood squares out of one ball. I'm going to be using the recommended hook size for that weight yarn, which is a 4mm hook. This is just a very old hook that I've had for quite a while. And you're also going to need a sewing needle just to weave in those ends. I have woven in this one. I haven't got round to this one yet, so make sure you've got your needle in hand to get those ends woven in, so we're not left doing all 52 or 54 squares at the end of the year. So gather your materials and let's get started. We're going to start by making a slip knot and placing that onto our hook. We're going to make a chain of 4 just by yarning over and pulling through. So that's 2, 3 and 4. We're going to slip stitch into the first chain that we made just by inserting our hook into that first chain next to the slip knot, yarning over, pull through and straight through the loop on your hook. We're going to be working into the center of the ring that we've created, not that hole where the slip stitch is, but into the center. I'm going to start by making a chain of 3. And this chain 3 that we've made counts as our first US double crochet, the same as a UK treble crochet. We're then going to yarn over the hook and insert into the middle of the ring, into that lower hole, not into where the slip knot is. I'm going to hold that tail around and work over it as we go. We yarn over, bring a loop up, so we have 3 loops on our hook, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, and that makes our second double crochet. We're going to make a third double crochet, remembering that chain 3 counts as our first. We've got 1 and 2. We yarn over, reinsert into the center, bring that loop up, so we have 3, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. Now the beginning of this square is just like a traditional granny square, so we continue on by making a chain of 2. That's 1 and 2, and that creates our corner space. We're then going to work a further 3 double crochets into that center ring again. So we yarn over, bring our loop up, pull through 2, pull through 2. So that's number 1. Do a second double crochet for number 2 and number 3. We make our chain of 2 to make our second corner. And then we repeat working those 3 double crochets into the center of our ring again. So we yarn over and insert, pull through 2, pull through 2 for number 2, and finally for number 3, we chain 2 to create our corner, and we've just got our final block of 3 double crochets to make. So we insert for double crochet number 1, number 2 and number 3. We make our final corner with our chain of 2, and then we're going to slip stitch to the top of that first chain 3 that we made. So So we just insert through the top of that chain 3. So there's 1, 2 and 3. Just going to push through, making sure I pick up 2 loops, and we're going to slip stitch to join, and that creates the beginning of our square. So you should have a total of 12 double crochets and 4 chain 2 spaces. Going into round 2 of our happy square, we're going to make a starting chain of 2, and this does not count as a stitch. So instead we're going to start by working a double crochet into the same stitch as our chain 2. So we yarn over, we're inserting into where we slip stitched to work our first double crochet. That's 1. And we need to make sure that we find that middle stitch, because the way that I do my chains, it always pulls it. So I've just made sure that there's the post of the stitch in the middle and the stitch I've stretched. So I'm going underneath that first loop and the second loop of the stitch to work our second double crochet. We work our third one into the top of the next stitch, and that brings us to our first corner. In each of the corners, we're going to be working 2 double crochets. That was number 1, this is number 2. We then chain 2 to keep that corner space, and we're going to work a further 2 double crochets into that same corner space. So it's just like a traditional granny square, or a solid granny square should I say. Now we need to make sure that we don't skip this first stitch. We should have 3 stitches to work across, and sometimes our stitches hide that first one. So if you pull your corner around a little bit, you'll find your first of the 3 stitches to work into. So we're working 1 double crochet into each of the next 3. So that was 1, 2, and there's number 3. We're then back to our corner, and we're going to work a further 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet, just like we did in the last corner. So there's double crochet number 1, number 2. We make our chain of 2 to maintain that corner space, and then we're working a further 2 double crochets into that same corner space. And then to make sure we find that first stitch, so we're working 1 double crochet into each of the next 3. That's 2 and 3, before repeating that corner again. In the corners we're working 2 double crochets, that's 1 and 2, a chain 2, before working a further 2 double crochets into that same chain 2 corner space. Make sure you find that tricky first stitch. We're working 1 double crochet into each of the next 3. That's number 3. Before we work into our final corner. So working 2 double crochets, 1 and 2. We chain 2 before working a further 2 double crochets into that same chain 2 corner space, and we're going to join to the top of that first stitch that we made. So there's our chain 2, there's chain 1 and chain 2, and we're going into the top of the stitch, not the chain. So there's the post, and we're just joining to the top of the stitch at the top of that post with our slip stitch to join. So at the end of round 2, you should now have 28 double crochets. We've got 7 on each side. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. Just ignore your chain 2. But there we have our beginning of our square. Going into round 3, we're going to start our special stitches. We begin by slip stitching into the next stitch. Luckily I've got a colour change so you can see where we've joined, and we're slip stitching into the next stitch along, just by yarning over, pull through, straight through the loop on our hook. And we start with a chain of 2. That chain 2 does not count, so we're going to make a puff stitch into the same stitch that we've just slip stitched into. So we yarn over the hook and insert, yarn over, bring a third loop up, and we're going to do that for a total of 5 times. So that's number 1. So we yarn over, insert, yarn over, bring a loop up for number 2, keeping these loose and easy to kind of pull through all of them at the end. Yarn over again for number 3, bring a loop up, yarn over for a 4th time, reinsert all into that same stitch, and finally for number 5, yarn over, bring a loop up, and you should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, 11 loops on your hook. And we are going to yarn over and pull through all 11 loops on our hook. Oh, and through that last loop as well if it becomes a bit tricky. Now our puff stitches are closed with a chain 1, and that makes it really nice and puffy, but that chain 1 does not count as a stitch. But we're going to work into the chain 1 space on the next round. So we're going to skip the next stitch and we're going to work another puff stitch into the next. So we yarn over, skip that one, working into the next, and we yarn over, bring up a loop 5 times. That was 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yarn over, pull through all those loops and chain 1 to close. And we're going to skip the next stitch, and that brings us into our corner space. So into our corners we're going to be working 2 double crochets. That's 1 and 2. We chain 2, and then we work a further 2 double crochets. There it is. You see, it's gone awry already. We're going to make sure we skip this next stitch and we're puffing into the next. So we're going to work, so we skip the next stitch, working into the next, placing our next puff stitch with 5 yarn overs. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yarn over, pull through all the loops and chain 1 to close. My yarn's attacking me. We skip the next, so we're going to do this 3 times. So we skip the next, work our puff stitch into the next. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Pull through all the loops and chain 1. So even though we're not working into those skip stitches, because these puffs are so big and they create that nice little chain 1 space in between, it's not going to ripple our square. So we skip the next and work another puff stitch into the next. Oh, they're going to the stitch right. So I've yarned over, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Bring your loop through and chain 1. We skip that last stitch and we're back into our corner where we work 2 double crochets. We chain 2 and work a further 2 double crochets into that same chain 2 corner space. What we've just worked, we are going to repeat on all sides around to the last corner. So we skip the next stitch, working a puff stitch, skip 1, puff stitch, skip 1, puff stitch, skip 1, and we're back into our corner. So we'll do this other side together. So we skip 1, work into the next. So we're not working into that one. We're going into there with our puff stitch. 2, 3, 4, and 5. Pull through, close with our chain 1. Skip the next, puff into the next. 2, 3, 4, and 5. Pull through and close with your chain 1. Skip the next, work a further puff stitch. 2, 3, 4, and 5. Pull through and close. We skip the next, working back into our corner with our 2 double crochets. We chain 2 and a further 2 double crochets. That's 1 and 2. So repeat that for a third time back around to your final corner. So you're skipping the next, which is just underneath, working puff stitch, skip, puff stitch, skip, puff stitch, skip, 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet, and I'll meet you at the end of that last corner. Just working my final double crochet into that last corner. And we just need to skip the next stitch, working a final puff stitch into that next stitch. 3, 4 and 5. Oh, I got tangled there. Pull through and chain 1 to close, and then we're going to join to the top of our puff stitch. So there's our chain 2 that we made, and there's the top of our puff stitch just there. So we insert our hook through the 2 loops, not the chain space that I just did. So through that stitch, it's a little bit tricky to get it on there, and then slip stitch to join. You see how you've got that little loop underneath? That's the top of your stitch. So then we join. So at the end of round 3, you should have 3 puff stitches on each side, or a total of 12. So 3, 6, 9 and 12. And in each of your corners, you should have 4 double crochets and a chain 2 space, giving you a total of 16 double crochets. Going into round 4, we're going to be working into the top of the puff stitches and into the chain 1 spaces. We start with our chain of 2 that does not count, and we're going to double crochet into the same stitch as our joining. So we're just exactly, luckily again, I've got a colour change so you can see. We're going into the top of that stitch with our double crochet, and then we're going to work into the chain 1 space. So there's our chain 1 close, but we're going to work into the space here. So we yarn over and insert into that nice big space to work another double crochet. We then are going to work into the top of the next puff stitch. So you can see you've got your puff stitch here, and we work a double crochet there. Double crochet into the chain 1 space, and then we're going to work 1 double crochet into each of the next 2 stitches. So these are those double crochets from the row before, or round before. So working just directly into the top of those stitches, just as you would normally. That should bring you to your corner. Into our corners, we're working the usual 2 double crochets. That's 1 and 2. We chain 2 before working a further 2 double crochets. That's 1 and 2. Now this is where this pesky one could hide from us, and we need to make sure we work into it. So we've got this double crochet here, and there's the stitch we need to work into. So we're going from the post up into that little stitch to work 1 double crochet. We double crochet into the next, and then we're going to be working our first double crochet into this space between the last stitch and our next puff stitch. So we're kind of inserting in between this post and the puff to work our first double crochet. So that's 1. We work our next into the top of the puff stitch, 2, and then we're working into these chain 1 spaces. So making sure we work directly into the top of the puff stitch and then into that chain 1 space, into the top of the puff, and then we're working into that space in between. This brings us back to those 2 double crochets before our corner, and it's just hiding just under there. So we need to make sure we're working 1 double crochet into each of the next 2 stitches. So that was number 1. There's number 2. We're then back to our corner where we work 2 double crochets. So that's 1 and 2. We do our chain of 2, ready to work a further 2 double crochets. We're going to repeat this on each side of our square. I'm just going to remind you to not miss that first double crochet after your corner, because it's really easy if you hold your work like this, it's a bit hard to see that stitch. So just follow that post up to find that first double crochet to work into, we're working 1 double crochet into each of the next 2. So that's 1 and 2. You've got your 2 in your corner, 1 and 2, and then you work into the space between the last double crochet worked and your puff stitch. So into that space there. We're then going to be working into the top of each puff stitch and each chain 1 space across to your next corner. And of course in your corners you're working 2 double crochet, a chain 2 and a further 2 double crochets. So repeat that around, in fact all the way around to your last corner space, and I will meet you once you've worked that last corner where we can work the last few stitches together. I will see you in a moment. I've just worked my final corner. We need to make sure we work 1 double crochet into each of the next 2 double crochets from the previous round, working into that space between the double crochet and that puff stitch, and of course into the top of the next puff stitch, and most importantly into this chain 1 space here as well. We're going to join to the top of the first double crochet that we made, so ignore that chain 2. We're joining into the top of this first stitch, for the end of round 4. And bring that up so we can have a little count. So each side of your granny square should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 13, 14, 15 double crochets. 13, 14 and 15. So in total you should have 60 double crochets and your 4 chain 2 corner spaces. If you're missing any, they're most likely to be into that first stitch or into that puff stitch there. Remember not to count your chain 2 because you haven't worked into that either. Going into round 5, we start with our chain of 2. We're going to be making our first puff stitch into the same stitch as our chain 2. So we yarn over, you can see where my slip stitch is, there's my chain 2 underneath. We're working into this stitch with our 5 yarn overs, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Yarn over, pull through all the loops and close with your chain of 1. We then skip the next stitch, working a puff stitch into the next again. So we're skipping 1 and working into that one. So we skip 1, yarn over for 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, and pull through all the loops, closing with a chain 1. Now if you find that your puff stitches aren't as puffy, it could be that you're worried about things falling off your hook, which is a perfectly normal reaction. And I will state I kind of over exaggerate my movements, which is why I'm probably further away from the camera than normal. So we skip the next stitch. Let me show you a little bit slower. So we skip 1, we insert, we're bringing it right up, yarning over, reinserting, bring it right up. So that's 2, 3, 4 and 5. And yes, it is frustrating when it falls off your hook, when you pull through vigorously. Unfortunately, it is quicker just to rework the stitch than to try and faff around. So we're going to skip the next and work our next puff stitch. So we skip 1, working into the next with our final puff stitch on this side. 3, 4 and 5. Pull through and chain 1 to close. We skip the last stitch and we're back into our corner where we work 2 double crochets. Oops, that's 2. We do chain 2 before working back into the same corner with a further 2 double crochets, so our corners remain the same. You should by now have 4 puff stitches, and you've got those extra spaces that we made with those chain ones that closed our puffs. And we're going to do the same on each side from now. So we skip that first stitch over there and we're going over the second one with our puff stitch. That's 3, 4 and 5. Close with that chain 1 and skip the next. We repeat that all the way across. With a chain 1. So we end up with 7 puff stitches all the way across. So we skip 1 puff, skip 1 puff, etc. Skip 1 puff. So we skip this last stitch before our corner, and then our corners are always the same with 2 double crochets, a chain 2 and 2 double crochets. So continue to repeat that around. When you get to your next corner, you skip that first one and then start your puff stitches, skipping every other stitch. Repeat it all the way around to your last corner, and that's where I'm going to meet you to work those last few stitches together. So remember, we were skipping that first stitch after our corner before starting our puff stitches and working 1 puff stitch with our 5 yarn overs and skipping the next stitch to move along. In your corners, you've got that 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet, and continue to around till you reach your last corner, and that's where I'll meet you again in a moment. Just worked my final corner of this round, and we're going to skip the first stitch, ready to work that first puff stitch. 2, 3, 4 and 5. Skip the next and repeat just as we've been doing before, working that puff stitch. And then working 1 final puff stitch after we've skipped that next. Once we've done that final chain 1 to close, we're going to skip that last stitch and we're joining to the top of our puff stitch, just as we did before. Trying to get through the stitch, not into the chain 2 space. There we go. And slip stitch to join. This is a very colourful square, isn't it? So at the end of round 5, you should now have a total of 28 puff stitches. My chain 2 is a bit obvious there. Let's hide that a little bit. And of course, you'll have your 4 double crochets in each corner with your chain 2 spaces. So you should have 7 puff stitches on each side. And then your corner will have 2 double crochets at each end. Going into round 6, we start with that chain of 2 that does not count, and we're working into the top of our puff stitch. So I'm going to start where I joined, to that same stitch with a double crochet. We then work into that chain 1 space between our puff stitches and work into the top of our puff stitch. I kind of go into the chain 1 really, and then into that chain 1 space. You can see that's kind of the top of the puff stitch is actually there, but it looks a lot nicer if you go right into the top, into that top of the chain 1, and then into that chain 1 space that we created, into the top of the puff stitch, and then into that chain 1 space. Of course, we then need to work 1 double crochet into each of the next 2 stitches, and that takes us to our corner where we work 2 double crochets. That's 1 and 2. We chain 2 before working a further 2 double crochets into that next corner space. We work 1 double crochet into each of the next 2 stitches. Make sure you follow that post up to find the top of that first stitch. That's 1 and 2. We're going to work in between the last stitch and that first puff before working 1 double crochet into each of the top of the puffs and to each chain space across to the next corner. We're going to repeat this all the way around each of our sides. So on each side of your square, you'll end up with 23 double crochets, and that's including your corner stitches. So if you want to keep an eye on making sure you've got enough stitches as you go around, make sure that each side from your corner to your corner has 23 double crochets, and then you'll end on the right amount. As always, the most tricky ones are working back into those double crochets and making sure you work into that space between your double crochet and your first puff after the corner. So continue to repeat that all the way around, and I'll meet you after our last corner where we'll be ready to join. And then we'll be doing our final round. I'm just working my final few stitches into those last 2 double crochets, making sure I work into that space. And then we'll be ready to join round 6. I've got another colour change coming through. These seem to be really quick on this square. Make sure you work into that final chain 1 space before you join. And you can double check your stitch counts before you join if you want to. You should have 23 on each side of your square. You want to check that before you join, which gives you a total stitch count of 92 double crochets. So just like before, we're not joining to our chain 2, we're joining to the top of that first stitch that we made. And we just slip stitch to join. Wow, which one do you prefer? They're so different. It's the same square, just different colours. Wonderful. So for that final round of round 7, we're going to make a chain of 1, which does not count as a stitch. And we are simply going to work 1 US single crochet, the same as a UK double crochet, into each stitch around to the corner. Once you've reached the corner, we don't yarn over, we're going to be working 2 single crochets, 2 UK double crochets. We're going to make a chain of 2 and a further 2 single crochets into that same corner space, and this is where this first stitch really can very easily disappear. If you need to, just move your stitches out of the way, follow that post of the previous round up into that first stitch. So each side of this square with this round should have a total stitch count of 27 single crochets. Those of you who like to count as you crochet or check each row or each side of the square as you move around, you'll need 27 on each side, and that will give you a total stitch count of 108 when you're ready to make that final join at the end of round 7. So continue around, I'll meet you for our final join, and I'm going to show you how to finish off your project with the invisible join. So I've just reached where my join is. There's my chain 1. I'm skipping that and just slip stitching to join. Oops, she says. There we go, get both loops, yarn over, pull through, straight through the loop on your hook. And before I do a chain 1 to fasten off, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm going to just give myself about 6 inches, and I'm not actually going to slip stitch. I'm going to pull that back to my final stitch. You don't have to do this, you can just fasten off if you want to, but I'm going to pull that loop all the way through my stitch and grab my needle to finish off. So while I'm threading my needle, I'll just let you know, your stitch count for round 7 should be 108 single crochets, and you should still have your 4 chain 2 spaces. So because I haven't joined, my yarn is coming out of the top of this last stitch, and we're going to use the invisible join. So we just insert our hook from the right side out to the wrong side under that first stitch that we made, and we just pull that through. I'm going to pull it tightly because we're not adding to our stitch count here, and then we're going to insert our needle through the middle of the last stitch that we worked where that yarn's coming out, and pull through and make that disappear. So it makes it look almost seamless. We can then secure to the bottom of this stitch here just by making a knot. Oops. And then our stitch count remains unchanged, but we don't have that unsightly bump in the edge of our granny square. And that completes our beautiful happy square. Well, apart from weaving the ends, of course. So there we have our In the Mood happy square. Which one do you prefer? Let me know in the comments. I think I like this one better. Thank you so much for joining me as always, and I will see you in the next video.